Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this dinner of our International Space Medicine Summit. Some of you know I'm Ed Georgian, the founding director of the Baker Institute, and we are truly delighted to have all of you here this evening. I must say, today's deliberations were superb, and I think that this is truly a unique conference that holds a lot of potential for future work for all of us. It's really my honor and privilege tonight to introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight's dinner. He is a person that you all know, so I'm going to make a very brief introduction. Our speaker has run 5 presidential campaigns. He has been twice White House Chief of Staff. He was the 67th Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, the 61st Secretary of State. He's the author of 2 books, The Politics of Diplomacy, and another book that the title is Work Hard, Study, and Stay Out of Politics, which his family told him, which he simply did not follow. But most important title to me is that he is the honorary chair of the Baker Institute at Rice University. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in inviting to the podium Secretary James A. Baker.
And he's a Marine.
Semper Fi, General, Semper Fi. That's General Bolin saying I'm a Marine, and I am a Marine, but I want to tell you a little story that I told the General earlier. 2 days after I became Secretary of State, my executive assistant came in and said, the Commandant of the Marine Corps would like to pay you a courtesy call, Mr. Secretary. Would that be okay? I said, of course it would be okay, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. General Al Gray walked in 2 days later, 4 stars on each shoulder. It was all I could do not to get up out of my Secretary of State's chair and salute him. But we had a great little 10-minute or 15-minute chat, and as he was leaving, he said, Mr. Secretary, I have a gift that I want to give you, just as a memento of this visit. I said, well, thank you very much, General. He gave me a box, and in the box were some business calling cards. They were printed on Marine Corps camouflage background. And in the center of the card, in big letters, it said, James A. Baker III, Marine Warrior. And down at the bottom in tiny little letters it said, and Secretary of State. Ed told me to tell you one other story because he used that line about my having run 5 presidential campaigns in his introduction. And that is true, I did. And the title of that book, Work Hard, Study, and Keep Out of Politics, it comes from my grandfather's advice to the young lawyers who used to come to work for Baker Botts. He said, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and keep out of politics. And I tell people, I did 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I worked hard and I studied hard. But after running those campaigns, or actually after running the first of those campaigns, which was Jerry Ford's campaign in 1976, which we narrowly lost. People don't realize this, but Jerry Ford only lost that election to Jimmy Carter by 10,000 votes out of 81 million votes that were cast. If in the Electoral College you turned around 10,000 votes and Ford would have been elected. Well, by then I'd been bitten by the political bug, so I thought to myself, boy, I'm going to try my hand at this. I've been a lawyer for 14 or 15 years down here. I'm going to come down and try my hand at politics. And so I filed to run for statewide office. And in those days, Texas was as solidly Democratic as it is Republican today. Everybody that was in office was a Democrat. And yet here I was coming out of a defeated Republican administration. I filed to run for Attorney General of Texas. I never will forget one hot summer day. I'm at some little place up in the Texas Panhandle, somewhere, Lubbock or something. I see some people at a shopping center. I go over to give them some campaign literature. And I walk up to this guy. Now, bear in mind, as President Ford's national campaign chairman, I've gotten a lot of face time on national television. So I walk over to this guy, stick out my hand, introduce myself to him, and before I can say a word, he looks at me and he says, say, anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker? And I looked back at him and I said, yes, sir, often. He never batted an eyelash. He looked right at me. He said, "Doesn't it piss you off?" Well, that was the first clue I had that I might not win that race. Let me get serious, which I hate to do, but I will. I want to echo Ed Derigian's welcome to you for this third International Space Medicine Summit. Ed Derigian is our founding director, and he's done a remarkable job with this institute in the 15 years that he's been here. And this type of event is, I think, evidence of that. We're very, very proud to be co-hosting the event with Baylor College of Medicine. These two fine institutions have developed a partnership that we hope will continue to broaden and deepen. I was just telling Dr. Butler that I've always been a big fan of the idea that someday Rice University and Baylor College of Medicine would get together. I just think it's a natural. I hope it's beginning to move in that direction. I think it would be a wonderful thing. And therefore, I suspect that the partnership will continue to broaden and deepen. This space policy program here has long been a critical component of our research agenda, and it has been very ably directed by George Abbey, an individual, as all of you know, whose entire professional career has been committed to space exploration. George may be quiet, and he is, but he is extraordinarily effective, and he has a true passion for space. Bobby Alford, of course, is the very talented chancellor of Baylor College of Medicine, but perhaps more importantly, as far as I'm concerned anyway, he's my otolaryngologist. I got it, didn't I, Dan? Otolaryngologist. All of us, seriously, owe Bobby and George an immense debt of gratitude for their unstinting efforts in organizing this conference, because this summit brings together leading physicians, space biomedical scientists, engineers, cosmonauts, and astronauts from the spacefaring nations to discuss the medical challenges that humans experience during long durations of spaceflight. I particularly this evening want to welcome our Chinese colleagues who are attending this summit for the very first time. Their presence here will broaden our perspectives and will enrich our conclusions. Of course, there are going to be many questions about the future of space exploration, but one thing I think is for sure: China will play an important part in it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with just a little bit of history. Some of you are young enough that you may not remember all of this. A year and a half ago, the Baker Institute celebrated the 50th anniversary of one of the most significant events of the past century, and that was the flight of the first man-made satellite, the Soviet Union's Sputnik 1, in October 1957. That flight actually was a turning point in the Cold War. It startled the world, and it honestly alarmed the United States, which had until then believed itself the world's leader in space technology and in missile development. The surprise Sputnik launch and the failure of the first two United States satellite launch attempts provided a much-needed wake-up call to U.S. policymakers and our citizens alike. The crisis spurred a number of American initiatives, including the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which was signed into law by President Eisenhower in July 1958. This legislation created NASA, the civilian agency responsible for guiding the nation into the space age. The Soviet Union followed the triumphant flight of Sputnik with other successful space missions that culminated when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space in April of 1961. 3 months later, the space race was on in full swing when President Kennedy challenged our nation to send a man to the moon and to return him safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. By February 1962, the United States had achieved its first manned orbital flight when Mercury astronaut John Glenn circled the Earth. Fulfilling President Kennedy's challenge to reach the moon, I think clearly established the United States as the then world's unquestioned technological leader. In a little more than 7.5 years after President Kennedy's 1961 speech, the Apollo program had become one of man's greatest achievements when Apollo 8 orbited the moon. The following year, Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface. The Apollo program captivated the imaginations of young Americans and inspired them to become scientists and mathematicians and engineers. They became a brain trust that has fueled their country's technological progress ever since. Now, despite its importance for all of mankind, the Apollo program was really an American program. I stress this because the early years of manned space exploration were, to a very large extent, driven by the Cold War. While other factors were important, not least the abiding human desire to explore the universe, the U.S.-Soviet rivalry was clearly decisive in giving urgency to the efforts in both countries. Would man have reached the moon but for the Cold War? In my view, probably, but almost certainly not by 1969, a mere 12 years after Sputnik. As our nation's last Cold War Secretary of State, it is really quite heartwarming to me to note that that Cold War ended now almost 19 years ago. And thankfully, it ended with a whimper rather than with the nuclear bang that so many had feared. The end of the Cold War gave rise to a new geopolitical climate, and that new geopolitical climate has opened up vast areas for international cooperation. Today's manned space efforts, I think, reflect this new reality. This very evening, the International Space Station is orbiting Earth thanks to technology and machines provided by the United States, Europe, Japan, Russia, and Canada. As I speak, American and Japanese astronauts are flying together with a Russian cosmonaut. And control centers in the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and Russia, as well as tracking facilities in Australia, are working together to conduct research and to operate the station. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I think the International Space Station is as incredible a political achievement as it is a scientific one. When it is completed, the space station will represent the largest international cooperative technology project in the history of mankind. U.S.-Russian collaboration has been a critical part of this success. When then Russian President Putin visited the Baker Institute in November 2002, he said, "Particularly great here are the potentialities of the scientific community." Therefore, joint Russian-American research and development, in our view here at the Baker Institute, has very great prospects. And the two countries' cooperation on the space station helps nurture an atmosphere of mutual respect. We can only hope that this will serve bilateral relations well into the future. Predictably, I think the U.S.-Russian partnership has recently had its share of difficulties, just as I think all major endeavors of similar complexity probably do. But the strength and the durability of the U.S.-Russian space partnership has been demonstrated in times of crisis. In the wake of the tragic Space Shuttle Columbia accident, for instance, NASA officials were only able to maintain their operations on the space station through the outstanding support provided by their Russian colleagues and the Soyuz and Progress spacecraft. So the bottom line is clear. International cooperation is indeed critical to the future of manned space travel. So Russo-US cooperation will obviously be crucial, but so will cooperation with China, Japan, the EU, and indeed all countries committed to the peaceful exploration of space. And this summit is dedicated to broadening and deepening that cooperation in ways that advance knowledge and inspire the human imagination. 47 years ago, President Kennedy visited this university, and he gave a historic speech about space exploration. Right here in Rice's football stadium, not far from where we sit, he spoke of our exploration of the universe. "We set sail on this new sea," Kennedy said, "because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to all of us. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot hope to match President Kennedy's eloquence, but I do believe that it is important for us to recall the huge stakes, not just for the countries represented here today, but for all of mankind, in forging a common approach to discovering a universe whose wonders we have just begun to explore. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for attending this summit. Thank you also, Baylor College of Medicine, for cooperating with us to put it on. Thank you very much.